Hey, tonight, we're stepping back into the deep shadows of time. Not just a few thousand years, not even a few million, but 7.1 million years ago. A world so alien, so raw, that if you were dropped there for just a single day, you probably wouldn't recognize it as Earth at all. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. In this prehistoric landscape, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. The very first whispers of what would one day become human language. If you're enjoying this journey through deep time, I'd really appreciate a quick like, or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. And I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community connect through these stories of our ancient past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going back to when our ancestors were just beginning to discover that sounds could mean something more than just noise. 7.1 million years ago, the Earth was a stranger. Congratulations! You've just opened your eyes in the late Miocene epoch, and everything you thought you knew about communication is about to change. The air is thick and humid, filled with sounds you've never heard before. Around you, a world pulses with life, but it's life that operates on completely different rules than anything in our modern experience. You're not alone in this prehistoric landscape. Moving through the dense woodlands of what will one day become Africa, small groups of early hominids are beginning their slow, magnificent journey towards something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They don't know it yet, but they're taking the very first steps toward developing the most powerful tool our species would ever possess. Language itself. But let's be clear about what we're witnessing here. These aren't humans as we know them. They're something far more primitive, yet infinitely more important than we often realize. Standing perhaps 4 feet tall, covered in coarse hair, with faces that project forward and arms longer than their legs, they look more like upright chimpanzees than modern people. Their brains are roughly a third the size of ours, barely larger than a modern chimp's. Yet something is different about them. Something subtle but revolutionary is beginning to emerge in how they interact with their world and with each other. The sounds they make aren't random. They're not just emotional outbursts or instinctive calls. There's a pattern forming, a structure that will take millions of years to fully develop, but is already showing its earliest, most primitive signs. Watch them carefully as they move through their environment. When one spots a leopard in the distance, the sound they make isn't just a generic alarm call. It's specific. It carries information. Other group members don't just hear danger, they hear what kind of danger and roughly where it's coming from. This might seem simple, but it represents a cognitive leap that separates these early ancestors from every other species on the planet. The setting for this evolutionary breakthrough couldn't be more dramatic. 7.1 million years ago, Africa was undergoing massive climate changes that would reshape not just the landscape, but the very course of evolution itself. The continent was drying out. Dense forests that had covered much of East and Central Africa for millions of years were beginning to fragment and retreat. In their place, vast grasslands were emerging, creating a patchwork environment that demanded new survival strategies. This environmental shift was crucial because it forced our ancestors out of the trees and into a world where they had to think differently, move differently, and most importantly for our story tonight, communicate differently. In the safety of dense forest canopy, simple calls and gestures might be enough. But in the open savanna, where predators could approach from any direction and food sources were scattered across vast distances, survival demanded something more sophisticated. The early hominids of this period lived in small groups, perhaps 15 to 20 individuals who stayed together for protection and mutual support. But unlike modern hunter-gatherer societies, These groups weren't bound together by complex social contracts or shared cultural knowledge. They were held together by something far more basic, yet equally important: the beginning of shared understanding through sound. Their daily lives were consumed by the fundamental challenges of survival: finding food, avoiding predators, caring for their young, and navigating the complex social relationships within their small groups. But as they faced these challenges, something remarkable was happening in their brains. The neural pathways that would one day support human language were beginning to form and strengthen. Think about what communication meant in this world. There was no writing, obviously, no complex gestures that carried symbolic meaning, no abstract concepts that could be shared through elaborate pantomime. Everything had to be immediate, practical, and directly tied to survival. Yet within these constraints, our ancestors were beginning to develop something that had never existed before on Earth. Intentional communication that could convey specific information about the world around them. The sounds they made weren't words as we understand them. They were something far more primitive, but equally important. Vocal signals that carried meaning beyond mere emotional expression. A particular grunt might indicate a specific type of food source. A certain call might warn of a particular kind of predator. These weren't random associations. They were the earliest forms of symbolic thinking, where a sound could represent something that wasn't immediately present. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. These early communication systems weren't just about survival in the immediate sense. They were beginning to shape how these hominids thought about their world. When you have a specific sound for a specific type of danger, you're not just communicating about that danger. You're creating a mental category for it. You're developing the cognitive framework that allows you to think about that danger even when it's not present. This is the birth of symbolic thought. And it's happening not in the advanced brains of modern humans, but in the much smaller, simpler brains of our early ancestors. The implications are staggering. It means that the capacity for language isn't something that appeared suddenly with the evolution of larger brains. Instead, it was driving the evolution of larger brains. The groups that could communicate more effectively had significant advantages over those that couldn't. They could coordinate hunting efforts more efficiently. They could share information about food sources and dangers across the group. They could even begin to pass down knowledge from one generation to the next, though in very limited ways. Imagine watching one of these early communication events unfold. The sun is setting over the East African landscape, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. A small group of early hominids has gathered around a watering hole, the adults watching nervously for signs of predators while the young drink and play. Suddenly, one of the adults makes a specific sound. It's not loud, not panicked, but it carries unmistakable meaning. The others immediately understand. There's a crocodile in the water, just beneath the surface, waiting. The group moves away from the water's edge, but they don't flee in panic. The communication has been precise enough that they know the nature of the threat and can respond appropriately. This scene, played out millions of times across the African landscape, represents one of the most important developments in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors were beginning to use sounds not just to express emotions or attract attention, but to share specific information about their environment. They were creating the first primitive vocabulary, but language development at this stage was still incredibly limited. The sounds our ancestors made were tied directly to immediate, concrete experiences. They couldn't talk about abstract concepts, plan for distant future events, or share complex ideas. Their communication was anchored in the here and now, focused on the immediate challenges of survival. Yet even within these limitations, something profound was happening. The act of using sounds to represent specific aspects of their environment was beginning to change how their brains processed information. Neural pathways that had originally evolved for other purposes were being repurposed for communication. Areas of the brain that controlled facial muscles, breathing, and vocalization were becoming more sophisticated and more precisely controlled. This wasn't happening overnight, of course. The changes we're talking about unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, with each generation making tiny improvements in their ability to communicate. But the foundation was being laid for something that would eventually revolutionize not just how our ancestors lived, but how they thought about themselves and their place in the world. The early hominids of 7.1 million years ago couldn't imagine that their primitive grunts and calls would one day evolve into poetry, philosophy, and scientific discourse. They were simply trying to survive in a challenging environment, using whatever tools their evolving brains could provide. But in doing so, they were unknowingly setting in motion a process that would ultimately lead to the most sophisticated communication system in the known universe. As we watch these early ancestors navigate their prehistoric world, we're witnessing the birth of humanity's greatest achievement. Not tools, not fire, not even complex social organization, but language itself. The ability to share thoughts, ideas, and experiences through symbolic representation. It's a capacity so fundamental to who we are that we can barely imagine existence without it. Yet here, in this ancient landscape, it's just beginning to emerge. The first tentative steps toward a revolution that would change everything. The neural architecture that would one day support human language was undergoing its first primitive modifications in these ancient brains. But what exactly was changing? How do we know that something as abstract as early language development was actually happening 7.1 million years ago? The evidence comes from multiple sources, and it paints a picture that's both fascinating and unsettling. Fossil remains from this period show subtle but crucial changes in the structure of the skull and throat that suggest our ancestors were developing greater control over their vocalizations. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone that anchors the muscles controlling the tongue and larynx, was beginning to take on a shape more similar to modern humans than to other primates. But perhaps more importantly, the brain itself was starting to show signs of reorganization. Not growth, not yet. That would come much later. Instead, existing neural networks were being rewired, repurposed for new functions. Areas that had previously been dedicated solely to basic survival functions were beginning to serve double duty, processing both immediate sensory information and the symbolic representations that would form the foundation of language. This rewiring wasn't random. It was driven by the intense selective pressure of a changing environment. Those early hominids who could communicate more effectively about threats, food sources, and social relationships had a significant survival advantage. They were more likely to live long enough to reproduce, passing on whatever genetic mutations had enhanced their communication abilities. The sounds these ancestors made were still incredibly limited by modern standards. We're talking about perhaps a few dozen distinct vocalizations, each tied to specific, immediate circumstances. But within this limited repertoire, something unprecedented was emerging: the ability to combine sounds in meaningful ways. Watch as a group of these early hominids encounters a situation that requires coordination. They've discovered a carcass, perhaps left by a lion that's wandered off to rest in the shade. This represents a valuable food source, but it's also dangerous. The lion might return at any moment, and there are other scavengers in the area competing for the same prize. In this moment, communication becomes crucial. One individual makes a specific sound that indicates food, but then, almost immediately, another sound that warns of danger. These aren't random vocalizations. They're being used in sequence, creating a primitive form of syntax. Food plus danger equals proceed with caution. Other members of the group understand this combination and respond appropriately. Some take up positions as lookouts, while others quickly gather what meat they can carry. The entire operation is coordinated through these simple but meaningful sound combinations. This is the birth of grammar, though it's so primitive that calling it grammar almost seems like an overstatement. Yet the principle is there. Sounds can be combined to create meanings that are more complex than the sum of their parts. This represents a cognitive breakthrough that separates our ancestors from every other species that had ever existed. But let's step back and consider what life was actually like for these early communicators. Their world was one of constant uncertainty and danger. Every day brought new challenges that required quick thinking and coordinated responses. The climate was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Food sources that had been reliable for generations were disappearing as forests gave way to grasslands. In this environment, the ability to share information quickly and accurately wasn't just useful, it was often the difference between life and death. A group that could communicate effectively about the location of water sources during a drought would survive while others perished. Those who could coordinate their responses to predator threats would live to pass on their genes. The pressure to develop better communication was relentless. Each generation faced challenges that pushed the boundaries of what their primitive language could handle. And somehow, incredibly, that language began to evolve to meet those challenges. The process wasn't smooth or linear. There were false starts, dead ends, and evolutionary experiments that didn't work out. Some groups developed more sophisticated communication systems than others. Some innovations spread through populations while others died out with the individuals who created them. But gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, something remarkable was taking shape. The sounds our ancestors made were becoming more varied, more precise, and more flexible. They were developing what linguists would later call productivity, the ability to create new meaningful combinations from existing elements. This wasn't happening in isolation. The development of early language was intimately connected with other evolutionary changes that were transforming our ancestors. They were becoming more upright, developing better manual dexterity, and showing increased social cooperation. All of these changes reinforced each other in complex ways. As their communication became more sophisticated, they could coordinate more complex group activities. This led to better success in hunting and gathering, which supported larger group sizes. Larger groups created more opportunities for social interaction and communication, which drove further language development. Meanwhile, the changing environment continued to present new challenges that required linguistic solutions. The shift from forest to savanna meant that visual communication became less effective. In dense forest, gesture and facial expression could supplement vocal communication. But in open grassland, sound often had to carry the entire communicative load. Our ancestors adapted by developing more nuanced vocal abilities. They began to use pitch, rhythm, and volume in more sophisticated ways. A warning call might be high-pitched and rapid to indicate immediate danger, or lower and more sustained to suggest a distant threat that required monitoring but not immediate action. These subtle variations might seem minor, but they represent a crucial step in language evolution. They show that our ancestors were beginning to understand that the same basic sound could be modified to carry different types of information. This is the foundation of what linguists call prosody, the melody and rhythm of language that adds layers of meaning beyond the words themselves. The social implications of these developments were profound. As communication became more sophisticated, social relationships became more complex. Groups could maintain larger sizes because individuals could coordinate their activities more effectively. This led to the emergence of more complex social hierarchies and the beginning of cultural transmission of information across generations. But perhaps most importantly, the development of early language was beginning to change how our ancestors thought about themselves and their place in the world. When you have words for different types of experiences, you can think about those experiences in new ways. When you can communicate about things that aren't immediately present, you begin to develop a sense of past and future that goes beyond immediate memory. This cognitive revolution was still in its earliest stages 7.1 million years ago. Our ancestors couldn't yet tell stories, make plans for the distant future, or contemplate abstract concepts, but they were laying the groundwork for all of these abilities. The sounds echoing across the ancient African landscape carried more than just information about immediate survival needs. They carried the seeds of human consciousness itself. Every grunt, every call, every primitive attempt at shared meaning was a small step toward the magnificent complexity of human language and thought. As the sun set on another day in this prehistoric world, our ancestors settled into whatever shelter they could find, probably simple lean-tos made from branches and leaves. But even in these quiet moments, the revolution continued. The sounds they made to comfort their young, to maintain social bonds, and to express their basic emotions were all part of the same evolutionary process that would eventually give rise to literature, science, and philosophy. They couldn't know it, but they were creating the future of human civilization, one sound at a time. The groups that survived and thrived in this harsh environment weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones that could share information most effectively. And as these communication systems grew more sophisticated, they began to reshape not just how our ancestors interacted with each other, but how they understood their world. Picture yourself observing one of these early family groups during the dry season, when water sources were scarce, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and death. The group has been traveling for days, following ancient migration routes that exist only in the collective memory of the eldest members. Their feet are cracked and bleeding from the rough terrain. Their stomachs ache with hunger. Suddenly, one of the scouts makes a series of sounds that immediately changes the entire group's behavior. It's not just a single call, but a sequence of vocalizations that convey complex information. Water ahead, fresh, safe. The combination of sounds tells the others not just that water has been found, but what kind of water and whether approaching it poses any immediate dangers. This represents a quantum leap in cognitive development. These early hominids weren't just reacting to immediate stimuli anymore. They were processing symbolic information, understanding that specific sounds could represent things that weren't directly visible or immediately present. The scout who found the water could share detailed information about its location and condition with individuals who had never seen it. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. The information didn't stop with that single communication event. As the group moved toward the water source, other members began adding their own vocalizations to the mix. Warnings about potential predators in the area, updates about the condition of the weakest group members, assessments of how long they could safely remain at the water source before needing to move on. What we're witnessing is the birth of conversation, not the sophisticated dialogue of modern humans, but something far more primitive, yet infinitely important. Multiple individuals contributing different pieces of information to create a shared understanding of their situation. This collaborative approach to information sharing was unprecedented in the animal kingdom. The cognitive demands of this kind of communication were enormous. Each individual had to not only produce meaningful sounds, but also interpret the sounds made by others, integrate that information with their own knowledge and observations, and decide how to respond appropriately. The mental processing required was pushing these early brains to their limits and beyond, and those brains were responding to the challenge. Neurological changes that had begun hundreds of thousands of years earlier were accelerating. The areas responsible for vocal control were becoming more precise and sophisticated. Regions involved in auditory processing were developing enhanced sensitivity to subtle variations in sound. Most importantly, the connections between different brain areas were multiplying and strengthening, creating the neural networks that would eventually support human language. But language development at this stage wasn't just about communication between group members. It was also beginning to serve another crucial function: the storage and transmission of knowledge across generations. In a world without writing, without any permanent record-keeping system, the only way to preserve important information was through memory and oral transmission. Our ancestors were beginning to develop what we might call proto-traditions, specific sounds or sound combinations that carried information about seasonal patterns, migration routes, food sources, and danger zones. This knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It existed only in the minds of group members and had to be passed along through direct communication. The responsibility for maintaining this knowledge typically fell to the oldest and most experienced members of each group. These individuals had survived long enough to accumulate decades of experience about their environment, and they became living libraries of survival information. But their knowledge was only valuable if it could be communicated effectively to younger group members. This created intense selective pressure for both the ability to store complex information and the ability to transmit it accurately. Those groups that could pass down crucial knowledge from one generation to the next had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. They knew where to find water during droughts, which plants were safe to eat, and how to recognize the subtle signs that warned of approaching dangers. The sounds our ancestors used to share this knowledge were still incredibly simple by modern standards, but they were beginning to show some of the key characteristics that would define human language millions of years later. They were systematic rather than random. They could be combined in meaningful ways, and they could refer to things that weren't immediately present in the environment. Consider what happened when a group encountered a new type of threat, perhaps a species of predator they'd never seen before, or a poisonous plant that looked similar to something edible. The immediate response was survival-focused. Avoid the danger and warn others in the group. But something else was happening too. The group was developing new sounds to represent this new knowledge. These weren't conscious decisions in the way we might make them today. Our ancestors weren't sitting around debating what sound should represent a particular concept. Instead, the sounds emerged naturally from the immediate communication needs of the situation. But once established, they became part of the group's shared vocabulary, passed down to future generations as part of their survival toolkit. The process of creating new sounds for new concepts was driving another crucial development: the expansion of working memory. To use these primitive words effectively, our ancestors had to be able to hold multiple pieces of information in their minds simultaneously. They needed to remember not just the sounds themselves, but what those sounds meant, when to use them, and how they related to other sounds in their growing vocabulary. This expansion of working memory had profound implications that extended far beyond communication. It enhanced their ability to plan ahead, to consider multiple options before making decisions, and to understand complex cause and effect relationships. The development of language was literally making our ancestors smarter. But the path forward wasn't smooth or predictable. Environmental pressures continued to reshape the African landscape, creating new challenges that pushed our ancestors' communication systems to their limits. Extended droughts forced groups to travel longer distances in search of resources. Climate fluctuations made traditional knowledge less reliable. Volcanic activity and other geological changes altered familiar landscapes beyond recognition. Each of these challenges created situations where existing communication systems weren't adequate. Groups needed to be able to share more complex information, coordinate more sophisticated responses, and adapt their traditional knowledge to new circumstances. Those that could expand their linguistic capabilities survived and prospered. Those that couldn't faced extinction. The competition wasn't just between different groups of early hominids. They were also competing with other species that were adapting to the same environmental changes. Early ancestors of modern elephants were developing their own sophisticated communication systems. Various primate species were experimenting with different approaches to social coordination. The landscape was filled with evolutionary experiments in communication and cooperation. But our ancestors had stumbled onto something unique. While other species were developing more complex versions of essentially the same communication systems they'd always used, our ancestors were creating something entirely new. They were developing the ability to use arbitrary sounds to represent specific concepts, and to combine those sounds in systematic ways to create new meanings. This arbitrary quality of their emerging language was crucial. Unlike the communication systems of other species, which were typically tied to specific emotional states or immediate environmental triggers, the sounds our ancestors were developing could be used flexibly in different contexts. The same sound that warned of danger in one situation could be combined with other sounds to convey more complex information in another situation. The flexibility of this system was its greatest strength. As circumstances changed, as groups encountered new challenges and opportunities, their language could evolve to meet those needs. New sounds could be added to the vocabulary. Existing sounds could be combined in new ways. The communication system itself became a tool that could be modified and improved over time. This adaptability was being tested constantly. Groups that migrated to new territories had to develop ways to communicate about unfamiliar plants, animals, and geological features. Those that encountered other groups with slightly different communication systems had to find ways to bridge the linguistic gaps. The survivors were those whose language systems were flexible enough to accommodate these challenges. As thousands of years passed, something remarkable was happening to the social structure of these early hominid groups. The development of more sophisticated communication was enabling more complex forms of cooperation. Groups could coordinate activities involving multiple subgroups working toward different but related goals. They could make collective decisions based on information gathered by various group members. They could even begin to resolve conflicts through communication rather than physical confrontation. This shift toward communication-based problem solving was revolutionary. It meant that intelligence and social skills were becoming more important for survival than physical strength or aggression. Groups began to value members who were particularly skilled at communication, who could remember large amounts of traditional knowledge, or who could find creative solutions to novel problems. The implications extended to mate selection and child-rearing practices. Individuals who demonstrated superior communication abilities were more likely to be chosen as partners, passing on whatever genetic variations had enhanced their linguistic capabilities. Parents began to invest more time and energy in teaching their offspring, not just survival skills, but the communication systems that made advanced cooperation possible. Children in these groups were growing up in an environment rich with linguistic stimulation. They heard complex vocalizations from the moment of birth. They watched adults use sounds to coordinate activities, resolve disputes, and share information. Most importantly, they were actively encouraged to participate in these communication systems from an early age. This early exposure was crucial for language development. The human brain, even in its more primitive ancestral form, was most plastic and adaptable during childhood. Children who grew up hearing and using these early language systems developed neural pathways that were optimized for linguistic processing. They became more skilled communicators than their parents, and they passed these enhanced abilities on to their own children. Generation by generation, the communication abilities of our ancestors were becoming more sophisticated. The changes were gradual, almost imperceptible, within any individual lifetime. But over the course of thousands of years, they were revolutionary. The simple grunts and calls of earlier periods were evolving into something that was beginning to resemble primitive language. By 7.1 million years ago, our ancestors had developed communication systems that included dozens of distinct sounds, rules for combining those sounds in meaningful ways, and the ability to use those combinations to convey information about things that weren't immediately present in their environment. They could warn each other about dangers they'd encountered days earlier. They could share information about food sources located far from their current position. They could even begin to pass down traditional knowledge from one generation to the next. These achievements might seem modest compared to the complexity of modern human language, but they represented a cognitive revolution that was unparalleled in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors had discovered that sounds could be symbols, that symbols could be combined systematically, and that these combinations could be used to share the contents of one mind with another. The echoes of their primitive conversations carried across the African landscape like whispers of the future. Every sound they made was a step toward the magnificent complexity of human language and thought. They were creating the foundation upon which all of human civilization would eventually be built. And still, they were just getting started. The journey from these first tentative steps toward language to the sophisticated communication systems of modern humans would take millions of years and involve countless evolutionary innovations. But the most important step, the recognition that sounds could carry meaning, had already been taken. In the growing darkness of an ancient African night, as our ancestors settled in for another dangerous evening in their hostile world, the sounds they made to comfort each other, to maintain group cohesion, and to prepare for the challenges of another day were laying the groundwork for poetry, science, and philosophy. They couldn't know it, but they were giving birth to human consciousness itself. The transformation wasn't happening in isolation. As these early communication systems grew more sophisticated, they were driving changes in brain structure that would have seemed impossible just a few 100,000 years earlier. The vocal control regions were expanding, developing finer motor control over the muscles of the larynx, tongue, and lips. But perhaps more importantly, the connections between the auditory processing areas and the regions responsible for memory and planning were multiplying exponentially. This neural rewiring was creating something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. Our ancestors were developing the ability to hold multiple pieces of acoustic information in their minds simultaneously, compare them with stored memories, and use that comparison to predict future events. When they heard a particular combination of calls from a scout, they could immediately visualize the landscape being described, assess the potential risks and opportunities, and plan their response accordingly. But the real breakthrough came when these early hominids began to realize that they could manipulate their communication system itself. They discovered that slight variations in pitch, rhythm, and intensity could modify the meaning of their basic sounds. A warning call delivered in a low, steady tone might indicate a distant threat that required monitoring. The same call delivered in sharp, rapid bursts could signal immediate danger requiring instant action. This discovery of what linguists would later call prosodic variation was revolutionary. It meant that our ancestors were beginning to understand their communication system as a tool that could be refined and improved. They were becoming conscious of the relationship between sound and meaning in ways that no other species had ever achieved. The implications were staggering. Groups that mastered these prosodic variations could communicate with unprecedented precision. They could convey not just what was happening, but how urgent it was, how certain they were about their information, and what kind of response they recommended. This level of communicative sophistication gave them enormous advantages in the constant struggle for survival. Picture a hunting party from this period attempting to coordinate an ambush of a large herbivore. In earlier times, such coordination would have been nearly impossible. The hunters would have had to rely on visual signals and hope that everyone understood their role. But now, with their developing language system, they could actually discuss strategy. One hunter makes a series of sounds indicating the animal's location and movement pattern. Another responds with vocalizations suggesting an alternative approach route. A third adds information about wind direction and the animal's apparent alertness level. The entire plan is coordinated through acoustic communication, with each hunter contributing their expertise to the collective strategy. The success of such coordinated hunts had profound effects on group dynamics and social organization. Successful hunters gained prestige within their groups, But that prestige was now based as much on their communication skills as on their physical abilities. The hunters who could contribute the most valuable information, who could articulate their observations most clearly, and who could understand and build upon the suggestions of others, became natural leaders. This shift toward communication-based leadership was creating new selective pressures that favored intelligence, social awareness, and linguistic ability over pure physical dominance. The alpha male model that dominated most primate societies was beginning to give way to something more complex and collaborative. Groups were starting to value members who could think strategically, communicate effectively, and coordinate complex group activities. The changes weren't limited to hunting. Every aspect of daily life was being transformed by these expanding communication abilities. Food gathering became more efficient as group members could share information about the location, quality, and seasonal availability of different plant resources. Childcare became more collaborative as adults could coordinate their efforts to protect and educate the young. Even conflict resolution was beginning to rely more on communication than on physical confrontation. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might call cultural memory. Groups were beginning to accumulate and preserve knowledge that extended far beyond the lifespan of any individual member. Stories about past events, information about distant locations, and hard-won wisdom about survival strategies were being encoded in their expanding vocabulary and passed down through generations. These weren't stories in the way we understand them today. They were more like vocal maps, acoustic databases that preserved crucial survival information. A particular sequence of sounds might encode the location of a reliable water source, the seasonal behavior patterns of various prey species, or the warning signs that preceded dangerous weather conditions. The responsibility for maintaining these vocal databases typically fell to the eldest members of each group. These individuals had survived long enough to accumulate decades of experience, and they became living repositories of their group's collective knowledge. But their knowledge was only valuable if it could be transmitted accurately to younger group members. This created intense evolutionary pressure for both enhanced memory capacity and improved teaching abilities. Those groups that could preserve and transmit their accumulated knowledge most effectively had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. They knew where to find resources during difficult seasons, how to avoid known dangers, and how to take advantage of environmental opportunities that occurred only rarely. The process of knowledge transmission was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Elders weren't just repeating information verbatim, they were adapting their communication to the needs and understanding level of their audience. They were developing primitive pedagogical techniques, using repetition, emphasis, and contextual cues to help younger group members learn and remember crucial information. This teaching behavior was driving another important evolutionary development. Our ancestors were becoming increasingly aware of the mental states of others. To teach effectively, they had to understand what their students already knew, what they needed to learn, and how they were likely to respond to different types of information. This growing awareness of other minds was laying the foundation for what psychologists call theory of mind. The ability to understand that others have beliefs, desires, and intentions that may differ from one's own. The development of theory of mind had profound implications for communication and social organization. Groups whose members could understand and predict each other's mental states could coordinate their activities with unprecedented efficiency. They could anticipate problems before they occurred, resolve conflicts before they escalated, and work together towards shared goals with remarkable effectiveness. But this cognitive revolution was also creating new challenges. As communication systems became more sophisticated, they required more time and energy to master. Children had to spend longer periods learning their group's acoustic vocabulary and the complex rules governing its use. Adults had to invest more effort in teaching and maintaining their communication systems. This investment in communication was changing the fundamental economics of survival. Groups were dedicating increasing amounts of time and energy to activities that didn't provide immediate survival benefits but enhanced their long-term adaptive capacity. They were, in effect, trading short-term efficiency for long-term flexibility and intelligence. The trade-off was worth it. Groups with sophisticated communication systems were proving remarkably adaptable to environmental changes. When familiar food sources disappeared, they could quickly share information about alternatives. When new predators entered their territory, they could rapidly develop and disseminate effective avoidance strategies. When climate fluctuations altered their traditional migration routes, they could collaboratively explore and evaluate new options. This adaptability was being tested constantly. The late Miocene was a period of dramatic environmental instability. Volcanic activity was reshaping landscapes. Climate patterns were shifting unpredictably. Sea levels were fluctuating. Species were migrating, evolving, and going extinct at unprecedented rates. In this chaotic environment, the groups that survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the most numerous. They were the ones that could process information most effectively, adapt their behavior most rapidly, and coordinate their responses most efficiently. Communication was becoming the ultimate survival tool. The acoustic landscapes of late Miocene Africa were growing richer and more complex with each passing generation. The simple grunts and calls of earlier periods were evolving into elaborate vocal repertoires that included hundreds of distinct sounds and thousands of meaningful combinations. Groups were developing regional dialects, specialized vocabularies for different activities, and even primitive forms of artistic expression. Music was beginning to emerge from these expanding communication systems. Not the sophisticated melodies and harmonies of modern human music, but something far more primitive yet equally important. Rhythmic vocalizations that serve to synchronize group activities, maintain social bonds, and express emotions that couldn't be conveyed through ordinary communication. These early musical expressions were serving crucial social functions. They helped maintain group cohesion during difficult periods. They facilitated bonding between potential mates. They provided emotional outlets that reduced stress and conflict within groups. Most importantly, they were creating shared aesthetic experiences that strengthened cultural identity and group solidarity. The emergence of primitive musical behavior was also driving further neural development. The brain regions responsible for rhythm, melody, and emotional expression were becoming more sophisticated and more closely integrated with the areas involved in communication and social cognition. Our ancestors were developing what neuroscientists would later call the musical brain, a complex network of neural systems specialized for processing and producing organized sound. But even as these communication systems grew more sophisticated, they remained fundamentally tied to immediate survival needs. Our ancestors couldn't yet engage in abstract philosophical discussions or create elaborate fictional narratives. Their language was still grounded in the concrete realities of their daily existence: finding food, avoiding danger, caring for their young, and maintaining social relationships within their groups. Yet, within these practical constraints, something magical was happening. The sounds our ancestors made were beginning to carry emotional weight that extended far beyond their literal meanings. A call that warned of danger might also convey the caller's concern for group members. A vocalization that indicated a food source might be delivered with excitement that infected the entire group with anticipation. This emotional dimension of early language was crucial for its development. Communication that engaged both the rational and emotional centers of the brain was more memorable, more motivating, and more likely to influence behavior. Our ancestors were discovering that effective communication wasn't just about transmitting information. It was about creating shared emotional experiences that bound groups together and motivated collective action. The integration of emotion and information in these early communication systems was laying the groundwork for some of humanity's greatest achievements: the ability to inspire others through words, to create shared visions of possible futures, and to motivate collective effort toward common goals, all have their roots in these primitive but emotionally charged vocalizations echoing across the African landscape 7 million years ago. As another day dawned in this ancient world, our ancestors faced the same fundamental challenges that had confronted their species for millions of years. They needed to find food, avoid predators, care for their young, and navigate the complex social relationships within their groups. But now they had something that no species had ever possessed before: the ability to share their thoughts, coordinate their actions, and preserve their knowledge through the power of symbolic communication. The revolution was still in its earlier stages. The journey from these primitive vocalizations to the magnificent complexity of modern human language would require millions of years of further evolution. But the most important step had been taken. Our ancestors had discovered that sounds could be more than just noise. They could be meaning itself, encoded in acoustic patterns and shared between minds. In the growing heat of another African morning, as groups of early hominids began their daily search for survival, the sounds they made to coordinate their activities were carrying the seeds of human civilization. They were creating the foundation upon which art, science, philosophy, and all the other achievements of human culture would eventually be built. The first whispers of language were echoing across the landscape, and the future of human consciousness was beginning to take shape. The complexity of what was emerging in these ancient minds becomes even more fascinating when we consider the neurological changes that were happening beneath the surface. 7.1 million years ago, our ancestors weren't just learning to make new sounds. They were literally rewiring their brains in ways that had never occurred in any other species. The larynx was beginning its slow descent in the throat, a change that would eventually give humans unprecedented control over vocal production. This wasn't happening overnight, of course. The anatomical modifications that would allow for the full range of human speech were still millions of years away. But the process had begun, driven by the intense selective pressure for more precise vocal communication. More importantly, the brain regions responsible for sequential processing were expanding and developing new connections. Our ancestors were discovering that sounds could be arranged in specific orders to create different meanings. This might seem like a simple concept, but it represents one of the most profound cognitive breakthroughs in evolutionary history. Consider what happens when you can combine two sounds to create a meaning that's different from either sound alone. Suddenly, a limited vocabulary can generate an almost infinite number of possible messages. This is the principle of compositionality, and its emergence in the minds of our early ancestors was nothing short of revolutionary. Hooray! But these cognitive advances came with significant costs. Brains capable of processing sequential, symbolic information required enormous amounts of energy. The human brain today consumes roughly 20% of our total metabolic output, far more than any other organ. Even in its more primitive form, the expanding neural networks of our ancestors were placing unprecedented demands on their body's resources. This created a feedback loop that would shape human evolution for millions of years to come. Better communication abilities led to more successful hunting and gathering, which provided the additional calories needed to support larger, more energy-hungry brains. Those larger brains enabled even more sophisticated communication, which led to even greater success in resource acquisition. The groups that entered this positive feedback loop pulled ahead of their competitors at an accelerating rate. They weren't just surviving more effectively, they were beginning to transform their environment in ways that gave them additional advantages. They were learning to modify their surroundings to make them more suitable for their needs. Watch as a group discovers a seasonal fruit grove that provides abundant food for several weeks each year. In earlier times, they might have simply consumed what they could and moved on when the fruit was exhausted. But now, with their developing communication abilities, they could do something unprecedented. They could plan to return to this location at the same time next year. This required a cognitive leap that's difficult for us to fully appreciate today. Our ancestors had to understand that events could be cyclical, that patterns observed in the past might repeat in the future, and that actions taken now could influence outcomes weeks or months later. They were developing what we might call temporal thinking, the ability to mentally travel through time. The sounds they used to encode this temporal information were becoming increasingly sophisticated. They needed vocalizations that could refer not just to present circumstances, but to past events and future possibilities. This pushed their communication system toward greater abstraction, moving beyond immediate sensory experience towards symbolic representation of concepts that existed only in memory or imagination. The development of temporal thinking had profound effects on social organization. Groups could now make collective decisions about future activities. They could plan seasonal migrations, coordinate long-term resource management strategies, and even begin to prepare for predictable challenges like drought or harsh weather. These planning abilities were transforming the relationship between our ancestors and their environment. Instead of simply reacting to whatever circumstances they encountered, they were beginning to anticipate and prepare for future events. They were developing what ecologists call niche construction, the ability to modify environmental conditions in ways that enhance survival and reproduction. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might call social planning. Groups were beginning to coordinate activities that required different members to perform different roles at different times. This level of social organization demanded unprecedented communication abilities. Imagine a group preparing for a seasonal migration to new territory. Success would depend on careful coordination of multiple activities. Scouts needed to survey possible routes and identify potential dangers. Gatherers had to collect and prepare provisions for the journey. Others had to care for the young and elderly who might struggle with the physical demands of travel. In earlier times, this coordination would have been impossible. But now, with their expanding communication abilities, groups could actually discuss and plan these complex undertakings. Different individuals could contribute their expertise and perspectives. Problems could be identified and solutions developed before they became critical. The vocalizations used in these planning sessions were becoming remarkably sophisticated. They included sounds for different types of terrain, various weather conditions, specific time intervals, and even probability assessments. Our ancestors were developing a primitive but effective vocabulary for discussing uncertainty and risk. This ability to communicate about abstract concepts like probability and risk was driving another crucial cognitive development. Our ancestors were beginning to understand that their knowledge was limited and that their predictions might be wrong. They were developing what philosophers call epistemic humility, an awareness of the boundaries of their own understanding. This intellectual humility was actually enhancing their survival prospects. Groups that could acknowledge uncertainty and plan for multiple contingencies were more adaptable than those that assumed their initial assessments were always correct. They were learning to build flexibility into their strategies, developing backup plans for various scenarios. The communication systems required to support this level of strategic thinking were incredibly complex by the standards of the time. They needed sounds that could express conditionality, probability, and alternative outcomes. They were developing primitive versions of what linguists call modal expressions, vocalizations that could convey different degrees of certainty and possibility. But even as these communication abilities grew more sophisticated, they remained intimately connected to the practical challenges of survival. Our ancestors weren't engaging in abstract philosophical discussions about the nature of knowledge and uncertainty. They were using their expanding linguistic capabilities to solve concrete problems and enhance their chances of living another day. The practical focus of early language development was actually crucial for its success. Communication systems that provided immediate survival benefits were more likely to be maintained and passed on to future generations. Those that didn't contribute to survival were abandoned, regardless of their theoretical sophistication. This pragmatic approach to language evolution was creating communication systems that were remarkably efficient and effective. Every sound, every combination, every rule served a specific purpose in helping groups survive and thrive in their challenging environment. There was no waste, no unnecessary complexity, just streamlined efficiency in the service of survival. Yet within this practical framework, something beautiful was beginning to emerge. The sounds our ancestors made weren't just functional. They were beginning to show the first glimmers of what we might call aesthetic organization. Certain combinations of vocalizations were more pleasing to the ear than others. Rhythmic patterns were emerging that seemed to enhance both memorability and emotional impact. This aesthetic dimension wasn't purely decorative. Beautiful sounds were more memorable than ugly ones. Rhythmic patterns were easier to learn and transmit accurately. Emotionally engaging vocalizations were more likely to motivate action. What appeared to be purely artistic expression was actually serving important functional purposes. The emergence of aesthetic organization in early language was also creating new opportunities for social bonding. Groups that could produce beautiful sounds together were developing stronger emotional connections. Shared aesthetic experiences were becoming a powerful force for group cohesion and cultural identity. These early aesthetic expressions were laying the groundwork for all of humanity's future artistic achievements. The cave paintings of Lascaux, the symphonies of Beethoven, the poetry of Shakespeare, all have their ultimate origins in the simple but beautiful vocalizations of our ancestors 7 million years ago. But beauty wasn't the only thing emerging from these developing communication systems. Our ancestors were also beginning to discover the power of humor. They were learning that certain unexpected combinations of sounds could trigger laughter, and that laughter served important social functions. Humor was proving to be a powerful tool for reducing tension within groups. When conflicts arose, individuals who could diffuse situations with well-timed amusing vocalizations were highly valued. They were helping maintain group harmony and preventing minor disagreements from escalating into serious disputes. The cognitive requirements for humor were actually quite sophisticated. It required the ability to recognize patterns, violate expectations in surprising ways, and understand how others would respond to those violations. Our ancestors were developing what psychologists call a theory of mind, the ability to understand the mental states of others. This growing awareness of other minds was transforming social relationships in profound ways. Individuals who could understand what others were thinking and feeling could communicate more effectively, cooperate more successfully, and navigate social situations more skillfully. They were developing empathy, the ability to share and understand the emotions of others. Empathy was proving to be an incredibly valuable survival trait. Groups whose members could understand and respond to each other's emotional needs were more cohesive and effective. They could provide support during difficult times, coordinate activities more efficiently, and resolve conflicts more peacefully. The vocalizations used to express empathy were among the most sophisticated in our ancestors' growing repertoire. They required subtle variations in tone, rhythm, and intensity to convey different types and degrees of emotional understanding. These empathetic communications were becoming some of the most beautiful and moving sounds in the early human acoustic landscape. As the seasons changed and groups migrated across the African continent, they were encountering other populations with their own developing communication systems. These meetings created both opportunities and challenges. Groups could potentially share valuable information and resources, but they first had to overcome the barriers created by different vocal traditions. Some groups were developing techniques for bridging these communicative gaps. Individuals who were particularly skilled at learning and mimicking new sounds became valuable ambassadors, helping establish connections between populations with different linguistic traditions. These early translators were facilitating the first tentative steps toward cultural exchange. The encounters between different groups were also driving linguistic innovation. When populations with different communication systems came into contact, they often developed hybrid forms that combined elements from both traditions. These linguistic mixing events were creating new possibilities for expression and expanding the overall complexity of early human communication. But contact between groups also created opportunities for competition and conflict. Populations with more sophisticated communication systems often had advantages over those with less developed linguistic abilities. This created selective pressure that accelerated the evolution of language across multiple populations simultaneously. The competition wasn't just between different groups of early humans. Our ancestors were also competing with other species that were developing their own sophisticated communication systems. The African landscape was filled with intelligent species experimenting with different approaches to social coordination and information sharing. But our ancestors had stumbled onto something unique. Their combination of vocal flexibility, symbolic thinking, and social cooperation was creating communication possibilities that no other species had achieved. They were developing something that was beginning to transcend the immediate needs of survival and approach the realm of pure information exchange. This transcendence was perhaps the most important development in the entire history of life on Earth. For the first time, a species was using communication not just to coordinate immediate survival activities, but to share thoughts, ideas, and experiences for their own sake. They were discovering the joy of communication itself. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Once communication became valuable in its own right, not just as a tool for survival, it could evolve according to different criteria. Beauty, complexity, and expressiveness could become important factors alongside practical utility. The stage was set for the explosion of linguistic creativity that would characterize later human evolution. In the gathering darkness of another African evening, as groups of early hominids settled into their temporary shelters, the sounds they made to comfort each other and maintain social bonds carried the seeds of human civilization. Every vocalization was a step toward the magnificent complexity of human language and culture. They couldn't know it, but they were creating the foundation for everything that would make humanity unique among Earth's species. The ability to share abstract thoughts, to create fictional narratives, to engage in philosophical speculation, to compose poetry and music, all had their origins in these simple but revolutionary vocalizations echoing across the ancient landscape. The revolution was accelerating. With each generation, communication systems were becoming more sophisticated, more flexible, and more capable of expressing the full range of human experience. The journey from these primitive beginnings to the glorious complexity of modern language would require millions of years of continued evolution. But the most important step had already been taken. Our ancestors had discovered that minds could touch across the void of individual consciousness through the medium of organized sound. They had unlocked the secret of symbolic communication, and in doing so, they had set in motion the process that would eventually lead to all of human culture and achievement. The sounds echoing across the African savanna 7 million years ago were more than just communication. They were the birth cries of human consciousness itself, the first tentative expressions of minds awakening to their own limitless potential for connection, creativity, and understanding. The sounds that filled the ancient African air weren't just becoming more complex, they were beginning to carry something that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. Memory made portable. Experience transformed into something that could travel from one mind to another across the barriers of individual consciousness. Picture one of our ancestors returning to the group after a day of foraging, her arms empty, but her mind full of crucial information. She had discovered something extraordinary, a grove of fig trees in full fruit, hidden in a valley 3 hours' walk to the northeast. But she had also encountered fresh leopard tracks near the grove, and the scent markers suggested a female with cubs, making the area particularly dangerous. In earlier times, this information would have been nearly impossible to share effectively. She might have been able to lead others back to the location, but communicating the complex mix of opportunity and danger would have required crude gestures and hope that others understood her meaning. Now, with their developing language system, she could paint a detailed acoustic picture of what she had discovered. The sounds she made weren't random. They followed patterns that had been refined over thousands of generations. First came the vocalization for fruit, but modified with tonal variations that indicated abundance and ripeness. Then came the sound for location, combined with directional indicators that painted a rough map in the minds of her listeners. Finally, the warning calls that conveyed not just the presence of a predator, but its specific type, apparent behavioral state, and probable location relative to the food source. Her listeners didn't just hear these sounds. They processed them, integrated them with their own knowledge and experience, and began formulating responses. Some individuals made vocalizations that indicated understanding and agreement. Others added information of their own, perhaps about leopard behavior patterns they had observed, or alternative routes that might avoid the dangerous area. What we're witnessing is the birth of collective intelligence. Individual knowledge and experience were being pooled, analyzed, and synthesized by the group as a whole. The cognitive capacity of the entire group was becoming greater than the sum of its individual members. They were creating something that had never existed before, a distributed mind that could process information more effectively than any single individual. This collective processing wasn't happening automatically. It required sophisticated communication protocols that ensured all relevant information was shared, that different perspectives were considered, and that the group could reach consensus about appropriate actions. Our ancestors were developing primitive but effective techniques for group decision-making. The vocalizations used in these decision-making processes were incredibly nuanced. They included sounds that indicated agreement or disagreement, degrees of confidence in different assessments, and preferences for various courses of action. Most remarkably, they were beginning to include sounds that acknowledged uncertainty and requested additional information from other group members. This ability to acknowledge the limits of individual knowledge and seek input from others was revolutionary. It represented a fundamental shift in how our ancestors understood themselves and their relationship to information. They were moving away from a purely instinctive approach to survival towards something more collaborative and analytical. The cognitive demands of this collaborative approach were enormous. Each individual had to track not just their own knowledge and observations, but also the information being contributed by other group members. They had to evaluate the reliability of different sources, identify conflicts or inconsistencies in the collective knowledge base, and help synthesize all of this information into actionable conclusions. These mental gymnastics were pushing our ancestors' brains to their absolute limits and beyond. The neural networks responsible for working memory, pattern recognition, and social cognition were being stretched and strengthened with each collaborative problem-solving session. The brains that survived this cognitive crucible were becoming fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. But the transformation wasn't just happening at the individual level. The groups themselves were evolving, developing emergent properties that arose from the interactions between their communicating members. These group-level properties were proving to be incredibly powerful, adaptive tools. A group engaged in collective problem-solving could process far more information than any individual member could handle alone. They could consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, evaluate complex trade-offs between different options, and develop sophisticated strategies that took into account numerous variables and contingencies. The decision-making process regarding the leopard-guarded fig grove illustrates this collective intelligence in action. The group had to weigh the value of the food source against the risks posed by the predator, consider the needs of different group members, evaluate alternative food sources, and develop a plan that maximizes benefits while minimizing dangers. Individual members contributed different types of expertise to this analysis. The forager, who had discovered the grove, provided detailed information about the location, the quantity and quality of the fruit, and her observations about the leopard's behavior. Others contributed knowledge about leopard hunting patterns, alternative food sources in the area, and the specific nutritional needs of pregnant and nursing group members. An older individual, perhaps one who had survived previous encounters with leopards, might share vocalizations that encoded traditional knowledge about predator behavior. A young adult with exceptional observational skills might add recent information about the movement patterns of local wildlife. The group's knowledge base was becoming richer and more comprehensive with each contribution. The final decision emerged from this collaborative process wasn't imposed by any single individual. It represented a genuine consensus that took into account all of the available information and the needs of all group members. They would approach the fig grove in small groups during the early morning hours when leopards were typically less active, with scouts positioned to watch for signs of danger while others gathered fruit quickly and efficiently. This type of collective decision-making was transforming the social dynamics of our ancestral groups. Leadership was becoming less about physical dominance and more about the ability to facilitate effective communication and decision-making. Individuals who could help groups process information more efficiently, who could identify important patterns or connections that others missed, and who could help resolve conflicts that arose during discussions were becoming highly valued. The communication systems required to support this collaborative approach were incredibly sophisticated by the standards of the time. They needed vocalizations that could express complex logical relationships, conditional statements, and probability assessments. They were developing primitive versions of what linguists would later call argument structure, the ability to use language to present and evaluate different positions on complex issues. But even as these analytical capabilities grew more refined, they remained grounded in the immediate practical challenges of survival. Our ancestors weren't engaging in abstract logical exercises. They were using their expanding reasoning abilities to solve real-world problems that directly affected their chances of living another day. This practical focus was actually enhancing the development of their logical capabilities. Every reasoning error had immediate consequences. Faulty analysis could lead to injury, starvation, or death. The selective pressure for accurate reasoning was intense, and it was driving rapid improvements in our ancestors' analytical abilities. The groups that developed the most effective collaborative reasoning systems gained enormous advantages over their competitors. They could identify opportunities that others missed, avoid dangers that others fell victim to, and adapt more quickly to changing environmental conditions. Their superior information processing capabilities were translating directly into enhanced survival prospects. These advantages were becoming so significant that they were beginning to drive a new kind of evolutionary arms race. Groups were competing not just on the basis of physical capabilities, but on the sophistication of their communication and reasoning systems. Those with more advanced linguistic abilities were consistently outperforming those with less developed communication systems. The competition was driving innovation at an unprecedented pace. Each generation was developing new communicative capabilities that built upon the achievements of their predecessors. The rate of linguistic evolution was accelerating, creating a positive feedback loop that was propelling our ancestors toward increasingly sophisticated forms of expression and analysis. But this rapid evolution was also creating new challenges. As communication systems became more complex, they required longer periods of learning and practice to master. Children had to spend increasing amounts of time acquiring the linguistic skills necessary to participate effectively in group decision-making processes. This extended learning period was changing the fundamental structure of childhood and family relationships. Young individuals were remaining dependent on their parents and other group members for longer periods, requiring sustained investment in their education and development. Groups had to dedicate more resources to child rearing, but they were also producing individuals with unprecedented cognitive and communicative capabilities. The investment was proving worthwhile. The children who grew up immersed in these rich linguistic environments were developing neural architectures that were optimized for complex communication and collaborative reasoning. They were becoming more skilled at processing multiple sources of information simultaneously, more adept at identifying subtle patterns and relationships, and more effective at contributing to group problem-solving efforts. These enhanced capabilities were being passed on to subsequent generations, creating a cumulative effect that was driving rapid advances in linguistic sophistication. Each generation was building upon the achievements of their predecessors, adding new layers of complexity and capability to their communication systems. The sounds echoing across the African landscape were becoming richer, more varied, and more expressive with each passing century. What had begun as simple warning calls and location indicators was evolving into something that was beginning to approach the complexity of primitive language. Our ancestors were developing vocalizations that could express not just concrete information about their immediate environment, but abstract concepts like time, causation, and possibility. They could communicate about events that had happened in the past, predict future occurrences, and discuss hypothetical scenarios that might never actually occur. This ability to use communication to explore imaginary possibilities was perhaps the most revolutionary development of all. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species was using its communication system not just to describe reality, but to imagine alternatives to reality. They were developing what we might call counterfactual thinking, the ability to consider how things might have been different under other circumstances. This counterfactual capability was proving incredibly valuable for learning and planning. Groups could analyze past mistakes by imagining how different decisions might have led to better outcomes. They could prepare for future challenges by considering various scenarios and developing appropriate response strategies. They were becoming capable of learning not just from their own direct experiences, but from imagined experiences that existed only in their collective consciousness. The vocalizations used to express these counterfactual ideas were among the most sophisticated in our ancestors' growing linguistic repertoire. They required complex grammatical structures that could distinguish between actual events and hypothetical possibilities, between certain outcomes and probable scenarios, between past experiences and future projections. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to use these counterfactual capabilities for what can only be described as creative expression. They were developing vocalizations that described imaginary events, impossible creatures, and fantastical scenarios that bore no direct relationship to their immediate survival needs. This creative use of language was serving important social functions. It provided entertainment during long periods of inactivity, helped reduce stress and anxiety, and created shared imaginative experiences that strengthened group bonds. But it was also doing something even more profound. It was expanding the boundaries of what our ancestors could think about and discuss. By creating imaginary scenarios, our ancestors were exploring the limits and possibilities of their own cognitive capabilities. They were discovering that their minds could venture beyond the constraints of immediate experience, that they could manipulate ideas and concepts in ways that had no direct counterpart in the physical world. This discovery was laying the groundwork for all of humanity's future intellectual achievements. The ability to think abstractly, to manipulate symbols and concepts independently of their physical reference, to engage in pure reasoning divorced from immediate practical concerns, all had their origins in these early experiments with creative vocalization. The groups that engaged in these creative linguistic activities were developing cognitive capabilities that extended far beyond their immediate survival needs. They were becoming more flexible thinkers, more innovative problem solvers, and more adaptable to novel situations. The mental exercises involved in creative communication were strengthening their overall intellectual capabilities. But creativity wasn't the only thing emerging from these expanding communication systems. Our ancestors were also discovering that their vocalizations could be used to influence the emotions and behaviors of others. They were learning that certain combinations of sounds could inspire courage, reduce fear, promote cooperation, or resolve conflicts. This discovery of the persuasive power of language was transforming social relationships and group dynamics. Individuals who were skilled at using vocalizations to influence others were becoming natural leaders, even if they weren't the strongest or most aggressive group members. They were demonstrating that intellectual and communicative capabilities could be just as important as physical prowess. The vocalizations used for persuasion were incredibly sophisticated, combining logical argument with emotional appeal in ways that could move listeners to action. They required deep understanding of human psychology, keen awareness of social dynamics, and masterful control over vocal expression. The individuals who developed these skills were becoming some of the most influential members of their groups. But perhaps most importantly, these persuasive communications were beginning to serve a crucial function in maintaining group cohesion and resolve during difficult periods. When groups faced serious challenges, when resources were scarce, when conflicts threatened to tear communities apart, skilled communicators could use their vocal abilities to rally their companions and maintain collective commitment to shared goals. The power of inspirational communication was proving to be one of humanity's most important survival tools. Groups that could maintain morale and unity during difficult times were far more likely to survive and prosper than those that fragmented under pressure. The ability to use language to create shared vision and collective purpose was becoming a defining characteristic of successful human communities. As the sun set on another day in this ancient world, our ancestors gathered together to share the experiences and insights they had gained. The sounds they made weren't just reports of daily events. They were expressions of hope, fear, wonder, and determination. They were the voices of minds awakening to their own limitless potential for connection, creativity, and understanding. The revolution that had begun with simple warning calls and location indicators was accelerating towards something magnificent. Our ancestors were discovering that communication could be more than just a tool for survival. It could be a medium for sharing the full richness of conscious experience, for exploring the boundaries of imagination, and for creating bonds that transcended the immediate necessities of physical existence. The journey from these primitive beginnings to the glorious complexity of modern human language and culture was still in its earliest stages. Millions of years of further evolution lay ahead, filled with countless innovations, refinements, and creative breakthroughs. But the foundation had been laid. The most important discovery in the history of consciousness had been made. Our ancestors had learned that minds could touch across the void of individual existence through the magic of organized sound. They had unlocked the secret of symbolic communication, and in doing so, they had set in motion the process that would eventually lead to art, science, philosophy, and all the other achievements that would make humanity unique among Earth's species. The sounds echoing across the African savanna 7 million years ago were more than mere communication. They were the birth songs of human consciousness itself, the first tentative melodies in what would become the grand symphony of human culture and achievement. In those ancient vocalizations, we can hear the faint but unmistakable whispers of our own voices, calling across the vast expanse of time to remind us of how far we have traveled and how much we owe to those brave ancestors who first dared to believe that sounds could carry meaning from one soul to another. The implications of what was happening 7.1 million years ago extend far beyond simple communication development. Our ancestors were unknowingly laying the neurological groundwork for something that wouldn't fully emerge for millions of years to come. The capacity for recursive thinking. The ability to think about thinking itself. Watch as a group encounters a problem they've never faced before. A flash flood has swept away their traditional river crossing, forcing them to find an alternative route to reach seasonal feeding grounds on the other side. But this isn't just about finding another way across the water. It's about something far more profound that's beginning to stir in their expanding minds. One individual makes a series of vocalizations that roughly translate to the concept of moving upstream to find shallow water. But then something remarkable happens. Another group member responds with sounds that seem to question this approach. Not just disagreeing, but actually examining the logic behind the suggestion. They're beginning to think about the thinking process itself. This metacognitive awareness, this ability to step back and examine their own reasoning, was unprecedented in the animal kingdom. Our ancestors were developing what philosophers would later call second-order consciousness. They weren't just aware of their environment, they were becoming aware of their own awareness. The vocalizations used to express these metacognitive insights were incredibly sophisticated. They required sounds that could distinguish between direct observations and inferences drawn from those observations, between certain knowledge and uncertain speculation, between individual opinions and collective wisdom. Our ancestors were developing the acoustic building blocks of critical thinking. But this cognitive revolution wasn't happening in isolation. It was intimately connected to another extraordinary development that was transforming the social fabric of early human groups. The emergence of what we might call moral reasoning. The ability to evaluate actions not just in terms of their immediate practical consequences, but in terms of their effects on group harmony and individual well-being. Picture a scenario where food is scarce and a successful hunter returns with enough meat to feed only half the group. In earlier times, the distribution might have been determined by simple dominance hierarchies or immediate physical needs. But now, our ancestors were beginning to engage in something that looked remarkably like ethical deliberation. Different group members made vocalizations that expressed various principles for distribution. Some sounds indicated that the strongest members should eat first to maintain the group's defensive capabilities. Others suggested that pregnant and nursing mothers should receive priority to ensure the survival of the next generation. Still others proposed equal distribution, regardless of individual circumstances. These weren't just practical discussions about resource allocation. They were the earliest forms of moral philosophy. Primitive attempts to grapple with questions about fairness, justice, and the obligations individuals owed to each other. Our ancestors were discovering that survival wasn't just about physical capabilities. It was also about social cooperation and ethical behavior. The development of moral reasoning was creating new selective pressures that favored individuals who could navigate complex social situations with wisdom and fairness. Groups that could resolve conflicts peacefully, that could maintain cooperation even under stress, and that could balance individual needs with collective welfare were proving more resilient than those that couldn't. This was driving the evolution of what psychologists would later call emotional intelligence. Our ancestors were becoming increasingly skilled at reading the emotional states of others, at understanding the complex web of relationships within their groups, and at using communication to maintain social harmony. The vocalizations used to express empathy, comfort, and social support were becoming some of the most beautiful and moving sounds in the early human acoustic landscape. They weren't just conveying information, they were creating emotional connections that bound individuals together in ways that transcended immediate survival needs. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what can only be described as primitive storytelling. Our ancestors were beginning to use their communication systems not just to describe current events or plan future activities, but to share narratives about past experiences that carried lessons for the entire group. These weren't stories in the way we understand them today. They were more like extended vocalizations that painted acoustic pictures of important events, encoding crucial survival information in memorable narrative form. A particularly effective hunting strategy might be preserved as a story about successful hunters. Knowledge about dangerous weather patterns might be encoded as narratives about groups that survived or perished under various conditions. The cognitive requirements for storytelling were enormous. It required the ability to organize information sequentially, to understand cause and effect relationships, to maintain audience attention over extended periods, and to extract general principles from specific experiences. Our ancestors were developing the mental frameworks that would eventually support all forms of narrative art and literature. These early stories were serving crucial functions within their communities. They were preserving important knowledge in memorable form, transmitting cultural values from one generation to the next, and creating shared experiences that strengthened group identity. But they were also doing something even more profound. They were allowing our ancestors to live vicariously through the experiences of others. When a storyteller recounted a dangerous encounter with a predator, listeners weren't just receiving information about predator behavior, they were experiencing something like the emotions and insights that came with surviving such an encounter themselves. They were learning not just facts, but wisdom. Not just what happened, but what it felt like and what it meant. This vicarious learning was incredibly valuable for survival. Groups could benefit from the experiences of their most skilled and knowledgeable members, without everyone having to face the same dangers. They could accumulate wisdom more rapidly and pass it on more effectively. The storytellers were becoming living libraries of survival knowledge, but storytelling was also serving another crucial function. It was allowing our ancestors to explore hypothetical scenarios and their potential consequences without actually having to live through dangerous situations. They could experiment with different strategies and outcomes in the safety of narrative imagination. This capacity for mental simulation was revolutionary. Our ancestors were developing the ability to run what computer scientists would later call virtual experiments in their minds. They could test ideas, explore possibilities, and evaluate strategies without risking their lives in the process. The implications were staggering. Groups that could simulate various scenarios mentally were better prepared for actual challenges when they arose. They had already considered multiple options, evaluated potential risks and benefits, and developed contingency plans for various outcomes. They were becoming proactive rather than merely reactive. The vocalizations used in these mental simulations were pushing the boundaries of what their communication systems could express. They needed sounds that could clearly distinguish between actual events and imaginary scenarios, between probable outcomes and remote possibilities, between past experiences and future projections. This was driving the development of increasingly complex grammatical structures. Our ancestors were creating primitive versions of what linguists call tense, aspect, and mood systems that could precisely locate events in time and specify their relationship to reality. They were developing the linguistic tools necessary for sophisticated reasoning about time, causation, and possibility. But even as their communication abilities grew more abstract and sophisticated, they remained grounded in the immediate realities of survival. Every story, every simulation, every hypothetical scenario was ultimately connected to practical questions about how to live successfully in their challenging environment. This practical orientation was actually enhancing the development of their abstract reasoning abilities. When every logical error could have life or death consequences, when every faulty prediction could lead to starvation or predation, the pressure for accurate reasoning was intense. Our ancestors were developing cognitive abilities that were both highly sophisticated and ruthlessly practical. The groups that achieved the optimal balance between abstract reasoning and practical application were pulling ahead of their competitors at an accelerating rate. They could think more clearly, plan more effectively, and adapt more rapidly to changing circumstances. Their superior cognitive abilities were translating directly into enhanced survival prospects. This success was creating a positive feedback loop that was driving even more rapid cognitive evolution. Better reasoning abilities led to better survival outcomes, which supported larger group sizes and more complex social organization, which created even greater demands for sophisticated communication and reasoning abilities. The rate of change was becoming exponential. Each generation was achieving cognitive capabilities that would have been impossible for their predecessors. The gap between our ancestors and other species was widening rapidly, creating an evolutionary trajectory that was unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. But this rapid cognitive evolution was also creating new vulnerabilities. As our ancestors became increasingly dependent on their sophisticated communication systems, they became less able to survive without them. A group that lost its most skilled communicators through accident or predation might find itself unable to function effectively. This created intense selective pressure for the rapid transmission of linguistic knowledge from one generation to the next. Groups developed increasingly sophisticated methods for teaching their communication systems to young members, ensuring that crucial knowledge wouldn't be lost when older individuals died. The teaching methods were becoming remarkably advanced. Elders weren't just demonstrating proper vocalizations, they were breaking down complex communicative tasks into smaller components, providing structured practice opportunities, and using various techniques to enhance learning and retention. Children were spending longer periods learning their group's communication system, but they were also developing capabilities that far exceeded those of their parents. Each generation was building upon the achievements of their predecessors, adding new layers of sophistication and complexity to their linguistic abilities. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. Communication systems that had begun as simple collections of warning calls and location indicators were evolving into sophisticated vehicles for sharing complex thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Our ancestors were developing the capacity to live not just in the physical world, but in rich inner worlds of imagination, memory, and possibility. These inner worlds were becoming increasingly important for their psychological well-being. Individuals who could escape into mental landscapes of story and imagination were better able to cope with the stress and hardship of their physical existence. They were developing what we might call psychological resilience, the ability to maintain hope and motivation, even under difficult circumstances. The vocalizations used to create and explore these inner worlds were among the most beautiful and moving in our ancestors' expanding repertoire. They weren't just conveying information, they were creating experiences, painting acoustic pictures that could transport listeners to other times and places, other possibilities and realities. This capacity for mental transportation was proving incredibly valuable for group cohesion. When physical conditions were harsh, when food was scarce, when dangers were numerous, the ability to share uplifting stories and inspiring visions could make the difference between despair and hope, between fragmentation and unity. Our ancestors were discovering that communication could be not just a tool for survival, but a source of meaning and purpose that transcended the immediate necessities of physical existence. They were beginning to understand that the quality of their inner lives was just as important as their external circumstances. This realization was transforming their relationship with their own mortality. Death was still an ever-present reality, but it was no longer simply an ending. It was becoming a transition that could be prepared for, discussed, and even celebrated through the power of shared narrative and collective memory. The sounds echoing across the ancient landscape were carrying more than information about food sources and predator locations. They were carrying the hopes, dreams, fears, and aspirations of minds, awakening to their own limitless potential for growth, connection, and understanding. As another day dawned in this prehistoric world, our ancestors faced the same fundamental challenges that had confronted their species for countless generations. But now they had something that no species had ever possessed before: the ability to transform those challenges into opportunities for growth, learning, and collective advancement. The revolution that had begun with simple grunts and calls was accelerating towards something magnificent. Our ancestors were discovering that communication could be a vehicle for transcendence, a means of rising above the limitations of individual existence and touching something larger, more permanent, and infinitely more meaningful. The journey from these primitive beginnings to the glorious complexity of modern human consciousness was still unfolding, still accelerating, still revealing new possibilities with each passing generation. But the foundation had been laid. The most important discovery in the history of mind had been made. Our ancestors had learned that consciousness could be shared, that experiences could be transmitted, and that individual mortality could be transcended through the immortal power of language and story. In those ancient vocalizations, we can hear the first whispers of everything that would make humanity unique among Earth's species. The capacity for abstract thought, creative expression, moral reasoning, and spiritual transcendence. All of it emerging from the simple but revolutionary discovery that sounds could carry meaning from one soul to another across the vast expanse of consciousness itself. The transformation wasn't just happening in their throats or their brains. It was reshaping the very fabric of how our ancestors understood reality itself. 7.1 million years ago, they were beginning to grasp something that would seem obvious to us today, but was revolutionary then. The idea that their own thoughts and experiences weren't the only ones that mattered. Watch as a young member of the group approaches an elder who's been observing the sky with unusual intensity. The elder has noticed patterns in cloud formations that suggest weather changes are coming. But she needs to communicate not just what she sees, but why it matters and how certain she is about her predictions. The sounds she makes aren't just descriptive, they're layered with what we might call evidential markers. Vocalizations that indicate the source of her knowledge, her confidence level, and the reasoning process that led to her conclusions. She's not just saying that rain is coming, she's explaining how she knows, why she believes it, and what level of confidence others should place in her assessment. This kind of evidential communication was pushing our ancestors towards something unprecedented. They were developing what philosophers would later call epistemological awareness. The understanding that knowledge itself has different qualities, different sources, and different levels of reliability. The implications were staggering. Groups that could evaluate the quality of different types of information were making better decisions, avoiding more dangers, and taking advantage of opportunities that others missed. They were becoming discriminating consumers of information rather than passive recipients of whatever they heard. But this critical approach to information was also creating new social dynamics. Individuals who consistently provided accurate, well-reasoned information gained credibility and influence. Those who made claims they couldn't support or who demonstrated poor judgment lost standing within their groups. This was driving the evolution of what we might call intellectual honesty. Our ancestors were learning that their long-term credibility depended on being truthful about the limits of their knowledge, accurate in their reporting, and careful in their reasoning. They were developing primitive but effective systems of quality control for information sharing. The vocalizations used to express uncertainty, to acknowledge the limits of knowledge, and to qualify claims were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Our ancestors were developing acoustic markers that could distinguish between direct observation and inference, between personal experience and second-hand information, between established patterns and novel observations. This nuanced approach to knowledge was transforming how they learned from each other. Instead of simply accepting or rejecting information wholesale, they were beginning to evaluate it critically, to ask questions about its source and reliability, and to integrate it thoughtfully with their existing understanding. The cognitive demands of this critical approach were enormous. Each individual had to maintain not just factual knowledge about their environment, but meta-knowledge about the reliability of different information sources. the circumstances under which various types of observations were most accurate, and the logical relationships between different pieces of evidence. These mental frameworks were becoming incredibly sophisticated by the standards of the time. Our ancestors were developing primitive but effective systems for what modern scientists call peer review. Information wasn't accepted simply because someone vocalized it. It had to survive scrutiny, questioning, and comparison with other available evidence. This critical approach was accelerating the accumulation of accurate knowledge within groups. False information was being filtered out more effectively. Reliable patterns were being identified more quickly. The quality of collective decision-making was improving dramatically. But perhaps most remarkably, this process of critical evaluation was beginning to be applied reflexively. Our ancestors weren't just questioning the information provided by others. They were beginning to question their own observations, their own reasoning, and their own conclusions. This development of self-critical awareness was revolutionary. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species was systematically examining its own thinking processes, identifying potential sources of error, and actively working to improve the accuracy of its reasoning. The vocalizations used for self-correction and self-questioning were among the most sophisticated in our ancestors' growing linguistic repertoire. They required sounds that could express doubt about one's own previous statements, acknowledgement of reasoning errors, and willingness to revise conclusions based on new evidence. This intellectual humility was proving incredibly valuable for survival. Groups whose members could acknowledge mistakes, learn from errors, and continuously improve their understanding were adapting more successfully to changing environmental conditions than those that clung rigidly to established beliefs. The process of error correction was becoming a collaborative enterprise. When individuals made mistakes in reasoning or observation, other group members would contribute information that helped identify and correct the errors. The entire group was becoming a collective intelligence system with built-in quality control mechanisms. These collaborative reasoning processes were creating something unprecedented in the natural world. Our ancestors were developing primitive but effective methods for what modern philosophers call distributed cognition. The thinking process was being shared across multiple minds, with each individual contributing their unique perspectives and capabilities to the collective analysis. The vocalizations required to support distributed cognition were incredibly complex. They needed sounds that could coordinate the reasoning process, indicate when individuals wanted to contribute additional information, signal agreement or disagreement with specific points, and help the group reach consensus about conclusions and next steps. But even as these analytical capabilities grew more sophisticated, they were being balanced by something equally important: the development of what we might call wisdom, the understanding that not all problems could be solved through pure reasoning, that some situations required intuition, empathy, and emotional intelligence. So the next time you speak, pause for just a moment and listen to the miracle happening in your throat, your brain, and your breath. Every word you utter carries within it the echo of those first tentative sounds made by our ancestors 7.1 million years ago. From simple warning calls in ancient Africa to the poetry you might write tomorrow. From primitive grunts around a prehistoric watering hole to the conversations that bind us together today. That's the journey we've all inherited, and it's still unfolding with every single thing we say to each other. And it's still unfolding with every single thing we say to each other.